All right, good afternoon, everybody, or good evening if you're somewhere else in the world, like Europe. This is session 4A, Remediating A&R, which also stands for Admissions and Records, and Technology Practices for Equity and Access. We have Mike Vogt. Do you pronounce it Vogt?
Yep.
Perfect. From California Virtual Campus Online Education Initiative, and we'll get to him just a second. But before we start, I wanted to make sure that you all know a couple things. One, that we have the captions enabled. So if you wish to turn those on, you just go down to the toolbar for the Zoom window and select either closed caption, or under the More button with the three dots, if your window is slightly minimized, you can just select the captions option there and then turn them on so you can see them. Next, while Mike is doing his presentation, we hope that you'll take advantage of using the chat, either to add comments about your own experiences related to the topics he's going to discuss, or to ask questions if you're unfamiliar with some of the topics he presents, or just want to know more, and so on. Last but not least, we're excited you're here. For those of you who are watching the recording, welcome. We know that many people can't join us in real time, but we're excited to have everyone participate. Over 700 people have registered for this conference, and we're always excited to share the ideas across the globe. So without further ado, I hand over the microphone to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, so this topic came up from our executive director, Marina, Aminy, who unfortunately couldn't be here today. But this is at the forefront of all of our minds at the virtual campus, because as we've kind of moved through implementing the exchange, and I'll share more about that shortly, we've encountered a number of different practices that really, if you look at them individually, they may not seem that damaging or difficult for students to navigate. But when you look at them in totality, the way that we have to, we've found that there's a lot of hoops that students may have to jump through to get into college, let alone to actually complete their coursework and graduate. And so that's kind of the catalyst for today's discussion, is around what are some of those practices and what can we do to help students on their journey. So a quick note about me: I am the Director for Information Technology at the California Virtual Campus. And I've supported implementation for the exchange for the past several years. And was the exchange, I'll touch on that. It is really a system-wide resource for all of the California community colleges, where a student who might be attending one of those community colleges can seamlessly and easily enroll in and take classes at another California community college without having to necessarily apply directly to that college. So it just allows them to expand their opportunities, so that they can, have access to those other classes to meet their course requirements at their home college. And really what we're trying to do is speed students on their way through their academic journey and their college experience at their home college. But maybe they can't always get that class they need at that school. Maybe it's offered out of sequence. Maybe they had a life event that took them out of the class when they were supposed to take it. Now it's not offered for another term or several terms. Maybe it's always full, or they have trouble, signing up for a class. And maybe they need an online class and it's only offered on ground, and they have a schedule conflict. There's a number of reasons where students run into these kind of hurdles at their own college where they've applied and been admitted to and been trying to complete a program at. And that's where cross enrollment really comes in, is to kind of build that access pathway to that same class or academic need, but can be fulfilled by one of our other partner institutions in the state of California. And the student gets to add that class very easily and experience that class very seamlessly, because it's all taken through Canvas, their online learning management system. So So that's what the CVC is, and that's kind of why we exist, is to make this experience easier for students. And I always like to start, presentation with kind of a frame of reference, or a quote. And this one always struck me, do you know the difference between education and experience? Education is when you read the fine print, and experience is what happens when you don't. That's from a great folk musician, Pete Seeger. But it really strikes a chord with me because we have a lot of fine print in education, which is kind of crazy because we're trying to teach people to kind of how to learn from their surroundings, how to navigate a job or interviews or just the world, by attending our classes in our institutions. And yet we have thrown up a lot of fine print that kind of serves as a barrier preventing them from even getting in so they can learn how to navigate some of these other things. It's like, wow, you almost need a degree to go to college to get a degree because there's some experience is required. And we found that as we've implemented, we've realized just how much experience is required just to even get your foot in the door, so you can get that program or that degree or that class even that you need to meet your other goals or your journey. And so that the image there on screen always reminds me of a story about the value of experience. And there's a story of a ship where the engine stalls, and they call in this technician with 40 years of experience, and they're like, can you fix this ship? And he kind of looks at it and looks at the engines, and then after just a couple of minutes, he takes out a hammer, knocks on one part of the engine, and the engine springs back to life, and the ship is back on its way. And so they're like, great, this is amazing. Can you send us a bill? And so he sends them a bill for $20,000. And they're like, you just tapped on the engine, it can't be that valuable. He's like, yes, tapping is two. They said, we need a itemized receipt. And he's like, great, tapping $2. Knowing where and when to tap, well, that's $19,998. And that's what we put in for our students, is to say, hey, you have to know where and when to tap to get into our program so we can teach you how to tap. And it's kind of crazy that we've done that, but we've done it often inadvertently, and maybe we don't even realize that's happened. And so the exchange has been a unique experience for us. And I do want to say that everything I say, this is not a criticism of the CCCs in any way. We are all subjects of experience ourselves. And a lot of the processes that have been put in place were for a very good reason, that it was based on experience of we were trying to handle certain situations certain ways. So we added a process to do that. But what we've run into is, as we've implemented, we've seen just that the totality of all those different processes can sometimes be very intimidating for students, almost insurmountable. And so when we look at these as individual steps, out of context, it looks fine. It's like, hey, that's just one individual step. But when you look at them all added up, it can be a very long staircase to admission. And especially if you're a student who's coming from a different background, we could consider that almost like that's insurmountable if you have difficulty with stairs. Like if you struggle with one step, think about adding multiple stairs all in a row. And that's really what we've seen is these onboarding processes. There's just a number of different requirements that students have to navigate, which can be a barrier to mobility, to moving between institutions, because we often think of admissions as happening one time at the beginning of a student's experience. So they apply to college, they come out of high school. This is the happy path I'm describing. They come out of high school, they apply to a college, they're admitted. That's it. They never have to do that admissions process again. But that is just not the case in today's experience for students, where a student may have to move around to different colleges. They we have a very mobile and diverse population of students in the community college system in California. They're constantly moving around for jobs or different other needs. Especially their experience with community colleges might require them to apply to multiple institutions or kind of rotate between a series of institutions in a geographic area, because one year they're over here, next term they're over a different area slightly, or it just makes more sense for them to take classes at that community college versus the one they've been attending. And that becomes really, really difficult for them to kind of constantly move between those colleges and get readmitted or newly admitted at a different institution. So again, when we're looking at these things individually, even an individual college's onboarding process might not be that insurmountable. But when you take that in combination with several other colleges, maybe in the same term or the same year, well, now it's becoming more and more burdensome for students to move around, and so therefore they don't. And then that locks them into one program or one sequence of classes that they just can't get. And that's where, or that might not serve them the best. And that's where the CVC has come in to try and ease that mobility process for students. But we still run into problems ourselves. And so that's what I'll cover for the duration of today's session, is kind of what are some of those practices that we've run into or that students run into when they move between institutions, and how can we perhaps help through either cross enrollment or just help to kind of shine a spotlight on, so maybe we can provide some introspection, and as we go back to our respective colleges, we can maybe change some of those processes or remove those barriers. So I will start with a pretty easy softball. Obviously, prerequisites is one of the #1 challenges to mobility. And that's a class that you have to take in a sequence, or you have to complete another class prior to actually enrolling in this class. So there's a prerequisite that, hey, you have to complete English 1A in order to take English 1B. Makes a lot of sense. There's a great reason for that. Again, we can't criticize it, because we're trying to say, hey, in order to complete this class and be successful, you need some preparation. And that preparation was covered in the last class in the sequence. So have you completed 1A? Well, if you haven't, then you're probably not going to do very well in 1B. So there's a good reason for those prerequisites, but it is a challenge for a student to navigate, especially when they're moving around between different colleges. So maybe I did complete 1A at one college, but now I'm over in another part of the state or another part of the city, especially some of our larger metropolitan areas, urban cities. We have a lot of community colleges kind of stacked on top of each other. So maybe I completed 1A at one of those colleges, but then next term I'm right down the street at the other college and I need 1B. Well, that college has no idea I've completed 1A somewhere else. So I have to transfer in that credit. I've got to make sure they've reviewed and evaluated that transcript so that I can be cleared to take that next class in the sequence. So this can be a really major hurdle for students, especially those part-time students who maybe I took 1B or 1A a couple of years ago at an institution, way outside of this area. And I've even forgotten, where I completed that. But the concept is the same, is that prerequisites were really implemented because we all intended students to complete their entire academic journey with our institution. And so from that standpoint, that wouldn't be a major hurdle, because, well, they would have just taken the class earlier with, the other professor in the last term. So sure, that would be fine. But we really didn't think about prerequisites being a barrier for students who are very mobile. They move around. And so especially those part-time students who are kind of picking up different pieces of their academic journey at different times in their life, that's a big challenge. AB 705 was really meant to remove that or reduce that for transferable courses. Say, hey, can we take other different measures for meeting that preparatory element there, especially for these transferable classes. But in the system, in the technology system itself, the student information system, that still is considered a prerequisite. So it's a block on enrollment until the student has submitted one of those other, elements of preparation proof. And that is another block for a student who's highly mobile, that just the way that that is set up as a block on enrollment prevents them from just easily adding those classes unless they've gone through and submitted, other evidence in the application process. So another element with prerequisites is students don't know what transfers or how to request that clearance sometimes. So in the example I shared with 1A and 1B, that's pretty obvious. Well, that's assuming that they're called the same things at the different institutions that offer them. I've seen this happen where in some institutions it's 10A, other institutions it might be 105, and then the next class in the sequence is 110 and 115 and so on. So I have to kind of sort that out as a student. A lot of times we're thinking, well, the student's going to meet with a counselor or an ed planner or someone else who will advise them of what to do and what will transfer and what not. But again, that's an assumption that we're making, that students are doing this all with that kind of same frame of reference and knowledge and experience that we are considering as necessary to navigate this process. And not all students do have that experience. And so they may be looking at the titles and saying, well, this title is kind of like that, so I can piece this together that I have completed this prereq. Other students might be like, well, now they're telling me I have to complete 1A here, so I guess I gotta go complete 1A here at this college, not realizing that one of their other classes that they've already completed elsewhere could have fulfilled that. So we also see students have to resubmit, especially now in cross enrollment, we have a process that makes this much simpler for them to clear a prerequisite when they're trying to add. But I have seen students who have applied, went to add a class, hadn't transferred in the right transcripts at the time, and then so it wasn't automatic that they were cleared for that prereq. And then when they tried to add the class in the student information system at the college, they got that hold on the class essentially, and they didn't know how to clear it because there wasn't a clear process outlined for them. So that's something that we kind of took from those students' experiences, and we translated that into our system to say, hey, you do have to clear this. This class has a prereq. Here's what that means. You need to submit a transcript. The transcript will be evaluated within a given time frame by that college, and then we'll go ahead and get you into that class, and you don't have to do anything else. Just submit that transcript with this enrollment request. So that we've tried to help students on the way, but it's by no means a perfect system because prerequisites are still there, and there's a number of reasons why a student may start that process, but then maybe the class fills before the evaluator has had a chance to evaluate the transcript. Now we can't get them into that class. So prerequisites in general are a big hurdle to moving around the system, even when everything goes exactly according to plan. So just to highlight that as a common barrier for students, especially students who don't have that experience to kind of say, well, I know how to navigate a prerequisite class. So the final thing I'll say on that is that the fact that this process varies by college is also extremely challenging for a student, because maybe they have figured out the secret sauce at their other college where they started their journey, and they're like, oh yeah, I know how that works. And then they come to a different college and it's a totally different process that they have no experience with. Now, hopefully some of they're getting more and more savvy as they move about. They can kind of figure out, well, it's not the same process, but surely there's got to be a clearance officer or somebody to review this. There has to be a form somewhere so I can go track that down. Maybe, but maybe not. So it's just something that we're continuing to encounter, and Common Course numbering, we're hoping will help solve that, or at least make it easier for students to recognize, hey, they're telling me I need to take English 1B, It's called the same thing at my home college. I knew that, so now I can kind of move around this system with greater ease. So a second process we've run into as well when students cross enroll or just swirl. And swirling, again, definition, I should have thrown this up on a slide. That's when a student applies directly to another college or applies to multiple different institutions at the same time. They're kind of swirling throughout the system. Cross enrollment is a much more guided process than swirling, because swirling, they're kind of directly being admitted at all those different institutions, whereas cross enrollment is saying I'm being admitted at one institution and then I can cross enroll to another institution within the same system under this agreement that those two institutions have, and it's kind of guided. There's some parameters around that we can make things easier for them, but we also aren't just letting them be directly admitted and kind of treated the same everywhere as a local student. We're saying, no, this student actually came from another college and they're going back to another college to complete their program there. So this class needs to transfer, and a couple other things that I'll go over as well. So students run into these both prerequisites and drop for non-payment processes, whether they're cross-enrolling or swirling. So it's just a challenge for both students. And drop for non-payment is when the student adds a class, gets billed for that class, and then if they haven't satisfied payment for that class through either financial aid or direct payment by a certain date, they will be dropped from that class. And that can be a little bit of a challenge for students who are, especially students who are coming from an underserved or socioeconomically disadvantaged background, because they just don't have the funds readily available to just go pay for a class. And a lot of times we're thinking, well, if they're disadvantaged, we have services for them. We have things like financial aid in place. We have waivers. We have lots of things that we can do to help, which is very true. But everything is designed, again, for a student to come into an institution, remain at that institution the entire time throughout their academic career, and graduate from that same institution. So this works very well for returning students who have, during their orientation process, when they came in that first term, they were told about things like how to submit a FAFSA and how to, apply for a bog fee waiver or things like that. This was not really considered for students who were late admits or maybe hadn't come in that traditional freshman student user experience. They were really coming in as this student who was moving around the system, a part-time student, been enrolled in different classes at different institutions over a long period of time. And now maybe they've just seen this other class that they needed and they're trying to add it at the last minute. Well, for those students, they haven't had a chance to apply for a FAFSA yet. They haven't had a chance to submit their bog fee waiver application or CCPG application. So they don't have that financial aid, like, hey, don't drop for non-payment status on their account yet, because they're a new admin. And now, if they've added that class kind of last admit, they might run afoul of that exact drop for non-payment deadline, just depending on when they added and when that process is being run. It usually is run right before the start of the term. So any student who's still carrying a balance gets dropped from the class that they haven't paid for. Now, I note this has a double edge, because there are some upsides of drop for non-payment from a college or an institutional standpoint of, hey, we don't want students to just come in and take up seats if they're not serious about completing their program or paying for that class. Like, they're just kind of showing up. If there's nothing on the line, like a enrollment fee, then they might just drop out or really not take it seriously. And so and then they're denying a seat to a student who really did need that and would have taken this experience seriously. So what do we do? We can't just say, hey, anybody can take a class for free. There's really no you don't have to have any skin in the game, and everybody, you're good to go. You don't have to participate in the class either, because then you're really not serving your students who are really trying to wrap up their degree requirements as quickly as possible and needed that seat. So we fully recognize that that is a legitimate reason for a drop for non-payment, but it is something that students have to navigate as they're moving through. So I'm going to pause here real quick because I've covered a couple of things and just see if there's any questions or comments from the field. And we'll have some questions for you later that I do want you to share in chat. So we'll get to those in a second. All right. So one thing we've also noticed is that our systems are not always well serving for AB 540 students. And those are students who qualify for in-state tuition, but they're not, or they haven't established in-state residency. Maybe they're a dreamer, or they have some other status that they just don't have the same residency qualifications, but they still qualify for resident rates. So this covers a couple of different populations of students, but AB 540 is one of the biggest, is the dreamer population of students. So when students move around in the system, they have to recertify that status every time they move to a different college. And so they'll have to submit an affidavit, they have to provide their evidence, of why they still qualify. And that's not an easy process. It has gotten significantly easier within the last year. I believe the state system for the AB 540 application has allowed the student to essentially certify once, and then that original certification can be shared if they need to go to different institutions, so they don't have to continually recertify. But it is a challenge for students who are already having to go through a difficult process and announce their dreamer status. That has to continually re-announce that dreamer status. And so that's one thing that we've seen. A lot of students will just be like, maybe I just don't go to multiple institutions. Maybe I don't go back to college. Maybe that was not a good experience. And so the AB 540 student population dropped off significantly during COVID. And those numbers are starting to rebound, but they haven't rebounded the same way that, students who are FAFSA students were rebounding. So we're just not seeing those same volume of students cross enroll or just apply even anywhere in the state. And we don't know why, but we have our suspicions that's probably because this is not a very friendly experience for them. And so they're just like, hey, you know what? Got other things going on. I don't need another process that's difficult to navigate. So especially when they're applying for a CCPG promise grant status. This is one of our biggest pet peeves, I would say, from the virtual campus status or point of view. And it is around transcripts. So this is one thing a lot of people outside of A&R teams weren't super aware of around just what does it take to request a transcript. And everybody was like, oh yeah, it's probably super easy. Plus we have these 2 free transcripts as mandated by the state. So it shouldn't even be that costly. So there were a lot of assumptions about how transcripts worked and what it costs a student. And then as we started peeling this back for cross-enrolled students, we realized, oh my gosh, those were some pretty bad assumptions we had made. One, it's not always easy to find out how to even request that transcript. 2, sometimes those request processes were not super friendly for showing students that, hey, you have 2 dedicated free transcripts. Sometimes they had to select an extra box or kind of know the special handshake to get the free version of the transcript. Sometimes the free version is only a paper transcript. Maybe the student needed an e-transcript for expedited processing. And so they were just difficult to request and very difficult to get them for free. Now, a lot of those processes have really advanced in the past couple of years to where it's it is more easy to navigate for students, and the free is usually the default now for or for most institutions, I should say, where so the student always gets their first two free without them having to do something extra or special to request it as the free version. But this still, doesn't mean it's always free, because once they run out of those two, multiple transcripts can be costly, and that is not fair to students who are coming from different socioeconomic backgrounds, where that's already a burden for anybody, especially after you've completed the class or classes. Now to go have to pay extra just to get the proof that you actually completed those classes. Not always the best experience for students. So, and then there's an added hiccup of they may request it and pay for it from the delivering institution, but where they sent it to may not always process it right away, because maybe it wasn't accompanied by something like a transfer request. Like if I'm transferring into an institution, that process is pretty well mapped out, where, hey, if I get a bunch of transcripts for a transfer student, I know I need to evaluate those right away in the college. But if you're not a transfer student, maybe you're trying to just graduate from one college and you're trying to collect courses at that one college, such as a cross-enrolled student, that transcript delivery isn't always customized or accompanied by the same trigger that a college might be expecting, so they don't evaluate it, which I've always was like, well, it doesn't seem intuitive, like if I went through all the trouble, if I know all the trouble it takes to request a transcript, and I went through all that trouble, wouldn't we always assume that the student wanted us to evaluate that at the home college? But a lot of colleges get a lot of transcripts, and they don't always know why or what to do with them. So sometimes they just don't have the person power to actually just process every transcript that comes in. And so it might sit, and now the student has assumed, well, I sent the transcript, so now next term, when I go to take the next class in this sequence over at this institution, I've already had that transcript brought in, so I'm good, right? Well, now they didn't submit prerequisite clearance form or an evaluation trigger to trigger that evaluation at that college. So the transcript's there, but no one's looked at it, so it's not on their record. So that's another process that student has to somehow intuitively navigate without it being very intuitive. So we've tried to improve this for cross-enrolled students, where it's always free, no matter how many times they cross-enroll to how many institutions. They never have to pay for a transcript for that cross-enrolled class. And it is automatic, so they don't have to navigate the request process. That transcript is delivered back to the home college without them having to initiate that process. However, that's not a perfect process because of some of these other things on the screen, which is like the receiving institution gets this transcript, but they don't know what to do with it. So they haven't actually evaluated it. So we do have a improvement coming to send out a trigger at the home college, at the receiving institution, when a student cross enrolls, so that they do get timely processing that transcript. But again, another step that when combined with a bunch of other steps, it's getting trickier for students to navigate this, especially outside of the cross enrollment process. So I do want to pause here and just type in chat, if you would, what are some processes that maybe you have changed? Maybe I've just covered a couple when you're like, yeah, we used to do that and we no longer do that. So I can share one star college that we worked with was Chafee, and they had a pretty laborious prerequisite clearance form where a student had to submit actual official transcripts, which they have to pay for usually, or it's eating up one of their free transcripts at their home college. Or wherever they've taken that credit. And they had to submit official transcripts, and then they'd have to follow up with the respective departments to make sure they received them and evaluate them. And then they could go in and get that credit applied to their system and then actually cross enroll. Well, as a result of doing the cross enrollment experience, JV looked at that, was like, yeah, that doesn't make a lot of sense anymore. Like, why does it have to be official? Let's make it unofficial. Let's make it simpler. Let's make it faster, to where the student submits a form, with an unofficial transcript, and that serves as the trigger. They don't need to wait for follow-up and follow up with somebody to make sure that that was received. So if you have any examples like that you want to share in chat, go ahead and pop them in now. Give you 30 seconds and brush through. No takers? All right. Well, feel free to jump in afterwards, and you can share your examples. But given some of the things I've talked about already today, I did want to also invite that maybe you haven't already changed a process at your college, but you would like to change a process. So if you can outline, just share in chat, any examples of things you would like to change. Maybe it doesn't have to be anything that we've talked about already. It could be something else, like, hey, we have this really challenging process for students. I've helped students personally try and navigate something, and it's just awful. So I'd really like to change that if you want to share examples. It's a little vulnerable having to share your institution's difficult processes that you can outline, but I do want everyone to kind of think about what's something that you've identified maybe that you would like to change. If you don't feel comfortable sharing, that's okay too. So. And the reason I ask these questions is because I always joke colleges that as they do cross enrollment, they will get to know their own processes better than they ever have before. And they always laugh a little bit, but then they come back around, they're like, you weren't wrong. I was kind of like questioning, I was like, I know my processes just fine. Thank you very much. But then at the end of the project, they're always like, you were right. Like I shouldn't have taken that with a grain of salt. That is accurate. We actually did not know our processes as well as we thought. Now we've seen a couple of things through a different lens than we ever noticed before. So the next couple of things I'm going to share as we come up on time here is just some things that we've seen that maybe don't apply to cross enrollment, but are difficulty in the experience of a student, especially students who are applying separately or swirling, perhaps. So one thing that we've seen is application screening. There's a ton of fraud happening out there, and in an effort to combat that fraud, all of our colleges have implemented different fraud filters or spam filters to try and weed out some of those fraudulent applications. That's another area where cross enrollment helps, is because it's not going through an application process. The student has to authenticate as an existing student at one college where they've already been screened in order to cross enroll to another college and bypass that screening. So, or I should say, we've automated some of that screening. So, colleges are continuing to screen applications for good reason. But a lot of times we've seen, especially students who are outside of a traditional service area, but they need to apply to that college to just get that one class, and only that college offers it. And we see this a lot between North and South colleges in the state, where I'm a Bay Area student, and the only college who's offering the class that I need happens to be located in Southern California. Well, I'm well outside their service area, and that's part of the screening criteria. So I apply to get in because I can't cross enroll. Maybe the college isn't a teaching college. Maybe I'm not a current student at my home college. So I have to apply directly, but the application is going to get screened. And because I'm outside the service area, they never get it. And a lot of students really don't know when their application has been caught in a spam or fraud screen like that. And so that is difficult for the student to navigate, because they're just like sitting there waiting to hear back. They don't even hear, hey, your application's been flagged as potential fraud. Can you provide some additional confirmation? So they just never hear back, and then they never get that class. There's also strict certified study of program certified program of study requirements that are being implemented throughout the system. This is a good thing, again, to combat fraud. But the downside is it can discourage students from exploring, because they need that financial aid in order to enroll. Again, our students who are socioeconomically challenged are more heavily impacted by this than other students who can just pay out of pocket. So just like that drop for non-payment, if I'm a student on financial aid, I might really not be able to explore very much because I can't go outside my college or my program of study and get aid for that class, and I just can't afford it otherwise. So this is one thing that the cross-enrolled students are exempt from is term local fees, as they're termed. So things like library fee, student government fee, health fee maybe at that offering institution. If you cross-enroll, your local fees at that institution you cross-enroll to are waived. But if you don't, if you swirl, those fees are still enforced on your account. And even if you're a fully remote student and aren't going to use most of the things that those fees are for, you still have to pay those fees, and they're still assessed, which again impacts people differently based on their background. And so again, we're thinking of this one college, one term. We provide a service for a student. We need to charge that student that fee. Makes total sense. Good reasons behind these processes, but we weren't considering what if a student moves around to a lot of different institutions, has to pay these fees out of pocket every single time. And so it's just that lens that we're always applying. Textbooks and materials fees can be high. So ZTC and zero textbook costs and low textbook costs, really helpful for students. And so we try and highlight those on the exchange. But if you're not using the exchange, you still have to navigate those. Hey, I'm going to add this class. And then I find out that it has a really expensive textbook. I'm going to have to drop that class if I'm from a different background. So again, the lens we apply, we have to consider students who are mobile or from different backgrounds. Is this really a fair process that we have enacted? And that's a difficult question to answer. Proctoring and AIs, that's another thing that's on the horizon. I'm going to kind of skim through it because we got to wrap up here. But these are things where that just is another barrier for students where they're like, I've already navigated this one place. Now I'm having to navigate another place. And it just, those stairs begin to mount. And so it's a very challenging thing for students to navigate. So I will leave you with one final question, which is what is a process you will change maybe as a chance to have some introspection here on today's session. Where are some things that you really want to get in or out of the way for students to remove those barriers? So thank you, Desi, for sharing. Double authenticators prevent us from registering high school seniors to our college when their cell Wi-Fi signals are being blocked by the school during DSPS classroom outreach. That's a great example, that we assume that students are, all kind of operating with the same access to internet, but maybe not. There are things that are in place that well-intended, but now they're serving as a barrier to having that student have a real seamless experience with adding a class or enrolling in our college. So I'll leave you with a couple of general recommendations. One is we recommend regular enrollment workflow review. And that's why I always say colleges learn their process better because they actually have to walk through them as part of that cross-enrollment implementation. And that gives them the chance to be like, I never even knew we had that. I've never actually walked through a workflow enrollment process to actually try and add a class as a student. I've set up these things. I've been the administrator for years, but I've never done it myself. And when I did it myself, I started noticing things that just didn't make a whole lot of sense anymore or were unnecessary. And so regular enrollment workflow review, and when I say regular, I mean probably like every term or at least once a year, where you walk through as a student or with a student to see what they encounter in your own enrollment workflow. And then always ask yourself the question of how would a student know? Fill in the blank of what would they know, but how would they know if it's a process like a prereq clearance or a drop for non-payment fee or a drop for non-payment process? How would they know that was going to happen? Are they given regular warnings or alerts as they're using your interface? Are they given email notifications? How would they know that that process is being carried out or how to follow that process? Then we recommend review and simplifying those identified hurdles if possible. And I always say establish an easy benchmark. Like, what do you feel a regular enrollment process should take? How long should it take? What sort of expertise should you have to bring? Do you need to be that 40-year skilled engineer knowing exactly where to tap and when, or is there an easier way to do this? And then we always say challenge the reasoning and challenge the methodology. So if you see a process, ask why do we need that process? And then you can ask, well, maybe we do need that process, but is there a better way to do this that's not as inequitable to students who are maybe coming from other institutions or just brand new to higher education, don't know how to navigate these processes. So thank you very much for your time today. Thanks for listening to us, and we'll open it up if there's any last questions here.
Thank you, Mike. That was filled with ideas I know that I'm going to be bringing back to groups that I'm working with that are dealing with some of these issues. You bring up some really good topics that should be not top of mind, but in our minds as we go through this, like fraudulent enrollment, like the one that Desi brought up. We definitely need to be thinking about the student experience. And so I love the question, how would a student know? But then your recommendation of doing it with a student, not even pretending to be a student, but just having students come in and go through the steps that they normally do. So thanks so much for sharing this. And I know it's born of a lot of work. I don't know if people realize the amount of interactions that you've had throughout the state when, our system, again, we have people here from all around the country, all around the world, may not be familiar that the California Community College system has 116 different institutions, and all of them do things differently. And so to start creating some aspect of coordination and support for students as they take courses from different colleges, it's really important. And so thank you for all the work you and the California Virtual Campus team does. We do have a couple minutes for folks to ask questions, maybe via chat as we transfer over to the next person. And that word transfer was a slight pun, just like Mike at the beginning quoted a musician and said that it struck a chord with him. So I'll just say that we're going to do our best to keep people awake. But in the meantime, I'm going to stop the recording and we'll keep taking questions in the chat for anybody who has them for Mike.